Hi everybody, this is Tom Munley again. Welcome to ECTV Live with my co-host David DeCosmo. David, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Your Honor. Thanks so much.
It's such a wonderful day, David. The weather broke.
Yeah, we're going to talk about weather today, though, in a very negative way and nothing to do with snowstorms. Our guest today is going to be Alan Stout, who's with the Times Leader. And Alan and I share two strong things in common. First of all, we both have September 17th as our birthday.
Happy birthday in September. Happy birthday in September.
Second, and perhaps more importantly, the fact that we both have deep associations with what was the greatest natural disaster to hit the United States up until 1972, and that was the Agnes flood, the Tropical Storm Agnes flood.
I
was actually involved in the evacuation and communications. Alan is working on a project that should remind all of us about the Agnes flood. So Alan, tell us about the Agnes Flood Anniversary Project. What's up?
What we decided to do, well, you're first of all, you're being very kind to me because your involvement is much greater than mine. You were a working reporter at the time, helping get people out of town, whereas I was a 5-year-old in the back of my mom's car.
There's an age difference here.
So, but my interest is to preserve that legacy with the film. And so what we're trying to do, a group of 5 gentlemen that we have working on the film, myself, Frank Pasquini, Dr. Anthony Massari, Tony Brooks from the Historical Society, and Richard Briggs, our director, is make a definitive documentary, 90 minutes to maybe 2 hours, on the Agnes disaster of 1972, which includes everything from network archive footage to local video to home movies, photographs, people telling their stories. And we really just want to preserve it for generations to come.
I think the obvious question is why now? We're gathered here in February to talk about this. You've been on WYLN in Hazleton. You've been doing a lot, obviously, in the Times Leader itself. You've been on WILK Radio. The anniversary, if you will, obviously there's an anniversary every year, but it seems like the next point of interest would be in 2012, since the flood was in 1972. So why the effort now?
Because I think that, well, there's a few reasons for that. My personal interest in collecting some of the Agnes books and some of the videos was really for my children. I wanted to collect them and put them on the bookshelf for them to have someday. And as I started collecting various books that were published in the 70s on Agnes, and there were a couple of really good ones, and some of the local documentaries that had been made by VIA and NEP and BRE over the years, I saw great material everywhere. There's some great pictures in this book, there's some great stories in this book, there's some great video on this documentary, but it had never been brought together. And I thought, this happened back in May of this year, or 10 months ago. And what happened was, looking ahead to 2012, I realized that the 40th anniversary would be the perfect time to do that. And we had some time. We had 2 years to work on this, which was nice. Another reason that we wanted to do it now, too, was the simple fact that if you were a 40-year-old person, maybe with a family in 1972, and you lost your home and you had to evacuate, the reality is you're starting to get up there. And those stories, you're going to be 80 years old.
I have a story about the Agnes flood, David. It was in 1972. I was in law school, and one of my classmates in law school happened to live in Wilkes-Barre, and he was devastated. I went to law school 1,100 miles away at Loyola University. He had to fly home, and his whole family lost everything. He was devastated. He missed a couple of weeks of school. I'll never forget that. But isn't it amazing how resilient people are, though? I remember how much, how everything changed after a couple of months. But
and your friends' parents may no longer be with us.
They're not. They're not.
And that's why we want to do this story.
That's right.
Now, I in fact was a reporter with WILK Radio, and I was assigned to the courthouse, to the civil defense, which preceded the Emergency Management Agency. Civil defense was the agency then, and I was sent there to radio reports from the courthouse back to my base station at WILK. Ultimately, we developed a network of 13 area radio stations that cooperated, actually broadcasting the same thing at 1/4 each hour, and it was flood information. But your point, Alan, is well taken, because of the people in the Civil Defense headquarters, those who commanded civil defense, those who worked directly in that room, or when we moved because of the water coming up to another building. I'm one of the only ones left. And so as time goes on, your specific memories of what happened, A, can be a little clouded by time, and B, can be eliminated by the fact that the person is no longer there.
And just to add to that, when we put a slideshow together, which is on our website, and a trailer, and I showed it to some of the younger people that I work with, people under 30, under 35, people who weren't around during the flood, they couldn't believe it. They had heard about it, and maybe the old flood book is up in the attic somewhere, and they heard their parents or grandparents talking about it. But I remember showing it to one of my coworkers, and he said, "Oh my God, that's Boscov's underwater."
Yeah.
I'm like, well, yeah. And he just had no idea. It was called the Boston Store at the time, but it's the same building. The buildings he recognized underwater with boats going down South Main Street in Wilkes-Barre.
You know, it's amazing how things stay in your mind, David and Alan. Certain things, as I'm old enough to remember, poor John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, but this Agnes flood is something that always stayed in my mind also.
It touched so many people.
It touched so many people.
And Alan and I both have books. This one was published by the Times Leader. There's some dramatic photographs here. Alan, you mentioned the boats, and here's one right at the end of Main Street in Wilkes-Barre, rescue boats. These boats were launched from city streets.
Yeah, I think that's up on top of Blackman Street there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this would be the Susquehanna River. In the municipality of Kingston, there were approximately 20 homes that were not affected in some way, shape, or form by the rising water. And keep in mind, too, Alan, you and I talked just before going on the air, and although the specific number may elude us, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people evacuated from the greater Wyoming Valley, and a handful of deaths.
Yes, we did.
So that's got to be kind of amazing in itself. 2, perhaps 5, we're not really sure. And I guess that's another thing. You're still searching for specific data.
Well, there's one thing about floods. I mean, we live here in northeast Pennsylvania. It seems like different regions of the country have different things that they deal with. In the Midwest, the tornadoes, out west, the earthquakes, where people have no warning. I mean, it just comes out of nowhere. Whereas with the flood, normally if it's raining for 3 days, people know something's up. And I'm certainly, that has a lot to do with the lack of fatalities. But we still had them. A gentleman who was helping a rescue had a heart attack. I think someone drowned.
Right.
So, we have some video that we've acquired of people being rescued by helicopter from rooftops. And some of this video I've never seen before. And that's part of what's interesting about this film, is bringing some things, trying to put them into the film that has never been seen, including, as you and I were also talking about, the network footage and how this story was covered nationally, how Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor and these great anchormen from the 60s and 70s brought this story into the newsroom, into the living rooms of America.
No, Alan,
we have that.
I'm sorry, did you say you're working on this film for 2 years? Or
We started on it 7 months ago, and our
ago.
goal is to finish it in June of 2012.
Oh,
so
okay.
by the time it's completed, it will be a 2-year project.
2-year project.
Yes.
And then what plans do you have for the film when it's complete?
Our goal is to debut the film at the FM Kirby Center in downtown Wilkes-Barre on the 40th anniversary. It happens to fall on a Saturday, June 23rd, 2012. We've already spoke to the folks at the Kirby. We said they'd love to have us there, and sort of use it as a celebration of where the city is today, but also not forget what happened 40 years ago.
I mean, the city, David, had to be built from the first piece of wood up again. It was destroyed.
And that is the aftermath of the flood. The precursor, if I may show a couple other photos from one of the Agnes books. Here we see thousands of volunteers, and obviously just a picture of a few of them, who were volunteering their time to sandbag to try to stay ahead of the rising waters of the Susquehanna. And I will never forget, because I was in the Civil Defense headquarters, at one particular moment we were just told we can't beat it, it's going to beat us. And I was to get out right outside the building and do a report, I believe, for ABC News. And as I did the report, the siren sounded. And the siren was a message. We're done. We've lost the fight. We've fought the good battle, but lost it. Get out and get out now. And that's the words I used on the radio. Get out and get out now. And on the other side of this same page, you see Public Square in Wilkes-Barre as it looked after that water did in fact come through. Fortunately, there was time to evacuate people before it started spilling over all over the place. But the damage, the devastation was unbelievable. And if I can find it here, I'm going to look, Anthony, we had another traumatic event that people may remember, is the fact that there were a series of buildings a series of homes primarily on South Franklin Street that went up in flames during the disaster. We have one shot here. Now, here are homes burning to the ground in the midst of this flood. And think when I say this, those people were lucky. Those people that had that fire were lucky. Why? Because they had fire insurance. They did not necessarily, and probably did not, have flood insurance. So,
That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
I had never heard that point made before, but yeah, if your house burned down, you were better off in the
you
long
were covered. Yep, you were covered. Now, Alan, undoubtedly, there are people out there yet who may have their own snapshots, who may have their own home video that perhaps has never been seen in all these years. Are you looking for that kind of material?
Absolutely. We want this to be the be-all, end-all Agnes film. We have worked with everybody at the local television stations who have been cooperative. We have worked with ABC, CBS, NBC, the BBC. People have been, we've been purchasing some of the video. Some people have donated to us. The local stations have all given it to us. But putting the word out to people that have things up in the attic, the Polaroid shots, the 8mm home movies, absolutely. We have had a few people step forward already and offer that stuff to us. And you might live in an area of town where we had nothing. You maybe live in Exeter or Wyoming or Hanover Township, and it's a part of the community where we don't have any video or any great photographs. And so absolutely, we are looking for that. And we do have a website. It's agnes1972.com. And there's contact information there to get in touch with us. And
Say that again so everybody has that. That's good.
Agnes1972.com. We tried to make it easy to remember. And you could also see our trailer there where we have a 7-minute preview of the film.
Speaking of trailers, I could remember pictures of hundreds and hundreds of trailers. I think they were brought in here by a special, there's an Army, when I was in the Army, we used to have they called it, I think it was a C-130 or C-150. And that's how they brought trailers in here. One of these big arm with the hooks.
Yeah, the mobile homes.
All the mobile homes.
The emergency
That's
shelters
right.
that were provided by the Federal Department of Housing and
Right.
Urban Development. But it should be noted that those mobile homes and those helicopters were, it was strongly encouraged that they come and were brought to the area by a gentleman named...
And I know who it is before you
Go
said
right ahead.
Dan Flood.
Absolutely.
And I knew that's what you were going to say, David. I remember.
Now, one of the stories, of course, Alan, is one flood versus another.
Yeah.
I've heard
I
that. We
remember.
definitely want to include that in the film. And even the trailers, after the flood, there was some controversies. There were people that weren't getting them in time, and
Right.
two neighbors would fill out their forms on the same day, and one guy would get it 2 weeks before the other, and so there was a lot of contention there. And the stories that happened from July and August through September of that year are interesting as well. A lot of discord among people. The Romney incident, which we were talking about.
Yeah, we had a lady who was, I believe, representing the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, Min Matheson, who confronted the Housing and Urban Development Secretary, George Romney. And when I say confronted, I mean in a very, very serious and tough way. But she was sounding out for the people, and she got results.
Right.
And these things all played out on the national news.
Right, national news. But there's something about Dan Flood because you were only 5 years old, as you said, Alan, but I'm sure you've seen many pictures of Dan Flood with this waxed mustache,
Sure.
and sometimes he'd walk around with the cape. He was just an amazing person, and David remembers, and I remember it so vividly.
Yes,
But he
yes.
was so, when he'd walk in a room, he was so impressive, wasn't he, David?
He was very impressive, and he also had a lot of very strong political clout because of his position on the Armed Forces Committee, which provides funding. And so when Dan Flood asked for helicopters,
That's
we were
right.
pretty sure you were going to get them.
That's right.
There were things that happened that were so horrible during that flood. And one of them that I recall was the fact that the river at one of its major bends broke through and literally tore up grave sites at the 44th Cemetery. And there were, in fact, disinterred bodies and caskets.
I believe it was over 1,000.
Yes,
it
that's
was
correct.
A lot of, and we have had some people send us some photos from that. Some of them which we have chosen not to put on our website, actually, because they're graphic and try to be respectful
Yes.
to the dead. But and those bodies, some of them were never properly identified as to what coffin they came from. So there's a mass grave out in Back Mountain where all those folks are buried, and there is a memorial monument in the 44th Cemetery to that. It came right through there, and
Yes.
it literally pushed them right up out of the ground. And some of them traveled all the way down towards the Midway Shopping Center. People found them in their front porches and their
Right.
backyards.
What was amazing, and what I remember, Alan, people lost everything. They didn't even have clothing to wear. I mean, whole families. It's hard for us to fathom this, but that's exactly what happened. People didn't have clothing. They didn't know where their next meal was coming from. They didn't have fresh water. That's how bad it was.
Yes, then President Nixon called it the worst natural disaster to hit the United States at that time. It brought in the likes of the president and the likes of Bob Hope. Bob Hope came in representing the Red Cross and asking that he would help
Excuse
out.
me.
God bless you.
Excuse me.
And there were some characters involved in this that were key. And we mentioned General Frank Townend, who was the Director of Civil Defense. And we mentioned, obviously, Congressman Dan Flood. But after President Nixon visited the area, he did something that most of us consider to be very wise. He appointed a special representative, Frank Carlucci, who was a Wyoming Valley native.
That's right.
Attended Wyoming Seminary, was at one time budget director, was head of the CIA, and he was the president's personal representative, and you could go to him every day and ask for things and get things done. And the media could get to him, and he was always very responsive. Who are some of the names that you hear coming out of this as you do the research?
Well, his name has come up often, and we have actually acquired some video from the networks of him actually being appointed. Richard Nixon in Wilkes-Barre on his visit, talking to the people. And I believe he came in early September, so it's about 6-7 weeks later. And he made his first visit here. He had, I guess, visited some other areas too, because Agnes affected Harrisburg. And,
Yes.
But he came here in September, and he appointed him. And the people were certainly ready for that change at the time. So he definitely did have a great impact. And of course, the governor at the time, Governor Milton. We have
Milton Shapp.
we have some video of him visiting the area locally. To answer your question, certainly Judge Rosen.
Yes.
Max Rosen.
He
right?
was he basically headed up the flood recovery task force.
Yes, and I was privileged to be a member of that as handling communications.
I
Another
interviewed
great- he
him
was a
about
great
that.
man.
I interviewed in 2002 on the 30th anniversary. I sat in his office and talked to him about that for close to an hour, and I'm so glad I had that opportunity.
We were told several days after the flood on our emergency radio network, we were told to talk to people. People were not generally allowed back to the devastated area for many days. And one of our tasks as communicators was to help prepare people and let them know that what they were coming back to was going to be very, very traumatic. And that trauma varied so much. You had people who lost homes totally. Fred Nye, reporter with, at the time, the Sunday Independent, actually saw his house go downstream, actually saw the house uprooted. On the other hand, you had other people that had damage that was certainly repairable, certainly cleanable, but a very difficult cleaning task. And then they would have lost things like personal photos, marriage photos, photos of family members now deceased that were gone forever because of this.
That's something that I hope we could bring into the film, because one of the things that when our group of that are making the film, we had a discussion about how are we going to be able to recreate that emotion? How are we going to be able to convey that experience of coming home to your home and everything being gone? Because if you have somebody sitting on their porch 40 years later reflecting on it, and the house has been fixed up for a long time, it might not come off as traumatic as it was. And we're very fortunate that we don't have to recreate it. We have the video. We have the people standing in front of the home at the time talking about it. And so the people that have seen some of these interviews on our trailer, we've had so many people tell us that they've wept when they've seen our trailer, which is just 7 minutes. But having people talk in that moment, at that time, about what they were experiencing, what you just talked about, coming home, maybe finding everything gone, or your photographs gone, things that will never be replaced. Nobody seemed to be complaining about, losing the television set. You could always buy a new TV, but it was those type of things that were irreplaceable to people.
And there's so many people who didn't even have a home to come to. And I remember how devastating it was. And as I said, I think about it, Alan, and now here you are doing something for the 40th anniversary. That's a great idea. Whose idea was that?
That was my idea.
It was your idea?
I'm fortunate that I have 4 other gentlemen that bought into the idea and are working with me on it, but initially it was my idea to try to do something for the 40th anniversary. And as I said, bring everything together. We have a couple of books here on the table. There's great pictures in all of them. I'd like to look
some
through
of the
them all.
housing devastation here as you're speaking. I'll just show a couple of these.
Riverside Drive in Wilkes-Barre in the Charles Street area were particularly bad. That's an area where I think people came back and found nothing. That was an area where the house was gone. We have some video of the cellar foundation where you could see the concrete, and that's it. And there's nothing. I can't imagine that.
No, and there was a terrible stench. The mud had, of course, filled basements, filled first floors, in some cases filled second floors, and had been sitting, and it was extremely warm. After the river subsided, you had very, very high temperatures. And so there was a terrible stench. This is one of the things we had to tell people, we had to warn them about, be prepared for this kind of thing. Now, the city of Wilkes-Barre, we look at the commercial district of Wilkes-Barre, which was obviously very wiped out, if you will. The city was completely rebuilt.
It was.
You had a brand new Wilkes-Barre in 1973. And ironically, some of that has now fallen into disrepair because, I think it was just 2 years ago now, we had street lights that were poles holding street lights that were set up after Agnes that began to collapse because the metal was so fatigued after those years. What do you think about the comeback?
I'll tell you, Judge Rosen, when I interviewed him in 1992, told me something that I hadn't realized, and it's reflective of exactly what you just asked me. In the early 70s, all across the United States, the malls were being built. Our mall in Wyoming Valley Mall was open in 1972.
That's correct. Yeah.
And everybody liked them. Everybody liked going to a mall, parking their car and going into 60 stores. And so downtowns across the country, this is what the judge told me, were starting to fail in the 70s. The flood came here right around the time this was happening.
Yes.
And so, but this trend hadn't been fully realized yet. And so we're sort of in this odd cycle where we need to rebuild the downtown because the downtown just got destroyed, but downtowns across the country were starting to decline everywhere. And so what the judge told me, and I'll never forget it, was the flood simply delayed a little bit of the decline of the downtown. It would have happened anyway. It was happening everywhere. People were going to these shopping malls. Now, downtown Wilkes-Barre, I think, has done a remarkable job of hanging in there and trying to overcome not so much the flood, but the trend of what's happened over the last 30 years with, the shopping hubs. We have the hub in Wilkes-Barre Township, and the mall's been there for 40 years now almost. And so, you see places like businesses opening down there, or nightlife opening on South Main Street with some nightclubs for people, and Redano's and the hardware bar and things like that. Barnes & Noble coming in, Movies 14. So I think there's a lot to be proud of, and I don't think that we should dwell too much on Agnes's impact on any of that, because if anything, it probably helped it, as you said. We have a segment that we acquired from CBS News that aired in June of 1977. Walter Cronkite introduces it, and it's Wilkes-Barre 5 years later. And it's the dedication of the fountain, and it's the canopy, and it looks fabulous. And that probably would not have been there if Agnes hadn't come through.
Well, I'm sure that there are people watching, and certainly a lot here in Lackawanna County as well, who participated perhaps by taking people in or sending donations, that maybe they may want to get involved in this in some way, shape, or form. What do they do?
Just our website is agnes1972.com. You can see all of our objectives from the film there. You can see our trailer there, and you can see how you can help out. If you have some home videos, or you have some pictures that you'd like to send, or you'd like to contribute in some way to the film in any way, agnes1972.com. It's an easy website. It's not a lot of bells and whistles. We want it to be informational. I'm not a fan of websites where if you go to them you can't find anything.
That's right.
It's clear, it says contact, and it's easy to find. So,
well, I certainly encourage and endorse anyone trying to help out. This was a big part of my life.
Yes.
I remember telling my wife I'd be home a little late, and 2.5 days later,
Yeah.
I came in for a few hours.
David's been always at all these events, and he's been wonderful, because everybody knows David DeCosmo's reputation is just wonderful at what he does. David, we're out of time.
his name keeps coming up with this film, so
Believe me.
we're going to be talking to him.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that, Alan. Anthony George, our cameraman, Mark Rigliori, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Anthony and Mark and Alexandra Kokori. David DeCosmo, you're wonderful as usual.
Thank you, sir.
Alan Stout, this was a great show and very informative. David picks the guests. He picked a great one with you, Alan.
Thank you,
Thank
Alan.
you very
that.
much. Thanks for having me.
And I know we're out of time, and we could have gone on for a couple more hours on this Agnes flood, David. But we'll do it again some other time.
As it gets closer, perhaps we can do another a follow-up.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, this is Tom Munley on behalf of my co-host David DeCosmo saying see you next week on ECTV Live.